Hello folks, the Y Guy here again. Welcome to my home on this very beautiful summer day. The name of this video is called The Y Guy, Origin of Hades. You know, I'm going to present evidence why the Greek word Hades does not simply mean death and grave, as Christendom has been led to believe. However, some will say it means the place of the dead. Okay, I had to put that in quotes. You know, similar to the Hebrew word Sheol. And that, my dear viewer, is the crux to the problem, because what does the place of the dead mean? It can mean something completely different from one individual to the next. That's critical, all right? It's an important question. An important question needs to be asked first. In its origin and throughout history, did Hades always mean death or grave, or even the place of the dead? That's a valid question, right? Did it always mean that? If we're going to use that word to define something, don't you think we should go back to its original definition? That only makes sense, right? Let's take a peek into history, all right? I want to first only address death and grave, that aspect, and ask the question, when did the word Hades possibly even start meaning death and grave in the minds of men? When did it actually start that? It's kind of hard to pinpoint the exact person that it began with, but I can come to an interesting conclusion here and see if you don't agree with me. Now, when I say in the minds of men, the possible answer is not in the minds of men in general, but potentially only in the minds of only a select few of men, of Hebrew men, Jews, who were captured by Alexander the Great and brought back to Greece in 332 BC. So then I have to continue that questioning with, did the word Hades exist before the publication of the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament, where Hades was often used, all right, in place of, in lieu of Sheol. So did the Greek word Hades actually exist before the Septuagint was written in 132 BC? And if so, what did Hades mean at that time? Way before. Here's the answer. 330, well, approximately, possible answer. 338 years before the Septuagint was written, there's a Greek philosopher that we're all familiar with by the name of Socrates. He was born in 470 BC. You know, long before the Septuagint of 132 BC. And he was born in Athens, and shortly thereafter he was followed by another fellow that we're all familiar with, the name of Plato. You know, and they both, if you read any of their writings about Hades, they both wrote about the king of the underworld who went by the name of Hades, and who later named his kingdom after himself. Okay? So the point, here's the point, for over 300 years before the Septuagint was written, the Greek culture had already defined Hades as something far different than death or grave that Christians promote. All right? So you see, the place of the dead, as Jews would refer to death or grave, simply didn't mean, the place of the dead simply didn't mean the same in the Jewish mind as it did in the Greek. Okay, it couldn't. Here's another question. Is tomb or grave a place of the dead? It's a place, right? Is it a place of the dead? You know, if true, then why in the hell, pun intended, why in the hell didn't the Greeks use their word for tomb or grave instead of using Hades? You know, even if they would have used the word Sheol, the original word, and the folks that was reading the Septuagint couldn't speak Hebrew any longer, they would still know what Sheol was. Come on. But if it simply meant death or grave, why not use the word for death, grave, tomb, or whatever? Why not use it? Here, I know this is an archaic way of doing it, but I got some goofy notes here of what that word is in the Greek, and how. See if you can see it on my camera lens here. Okay, do you see that word? Switch hands here so I can see the screen. There we go. That word means bury, or grave. All right? Now, my screen went blank. That's the Strong's Concordance of Strong's number 5028, if you want to check up on me. And it simply means a burial, hence a grave, a place for the dead body, as in a noun. So that's where a place comes in. Now, there's another morphology of Bible Greek, and they define it as this. See if this doesn't hit you. Okay? They define it as this, and they define it as this is an actual verb. And why is it important that it's a verb? The wind is blowing it. Anyways, because it's the action of being entombed, of being buried. All right? And you notice that word doesn't look at all. Neither one of those words looks like this one. And even a portion of this one isn't in any of those words. Are you catching me? Are you following me here, folks? That word is Hades. And yet neither one of those words, those Greek words, Koine Greek, are you following me? So instead they intentionally, and I can prove they intentionally, used a word representing a pagan belief in that. Was this done intentionally to support an agenda? You know, notice how I didn't even use the adjective hidden, as in hidden agenda? Because history openly spells out what that actual agenda was, if you just do a little bit of research. Because the Greeks caused and possibly instigated a Jewish civil war called the Maccabeite Wars. If you guys want to Google this, it's Maccabite. Maccabeite War. It started in 168 BC. And in that same year, if you look at any of the Greek governmental records of that time, that same year, in order to unify people, there's got to be reasons why people do things the way they do. In order to unify people, the Greek government tried to enforce a conversion to their pagan faith, and they required the usage of the Greek language only. Only the Greek language was allowed within their influence, okay? So the best way to unify people, frankly, is around religion. It really is. It's been that way for centuries. So think about this for a moment. What they did, it sure sounds like an agenda to me. It's not. I don't think I'm speculating too terribly much, folks. And is it honestly a reach to wonder if the Septuagint, that was written only 36 years prior to the Maccabeite War, was only the beginning and part of the Greeks' government plan? All right, by substituting Sheol for Hades, and rather than using the actual Greek word for grave, which is what Sheol means, and all in order to enforce the conversion of the Jewish populace at that time, to their pagan faith. Let's move on. I'm about halfway done here. As I mentioned in my first statement, that the term is very vague. There's a need to examine the phrase, a place for the dead. Because that term is vague, and it just can't stand on its own merits. And, it's self-explanatory. It requires further clarification, and here's why. Because by adding just one little word to the phrase, the place of the dead, one will get a completely different perspective than someone else. And because of that perspective, the phrase can easily be perverted in the mind of the ignorant. In the mind due to ignorance and theology. I've got some more notes here that I want to address here as an analogy of what I'm trying to convey. Let's use the phrase, a place for an apple. All right, just use something simple as that. Shoot, my notes are blowing right up into the screen here. So what do I mean by a place for an apple? Am I talking about a tree? That's a place. How about storage for apples? That's another good place. Or a pie. That's my favorite place. The point is, it requires clarification, right? You just can't say, place for an apple. Well, it's the same thing, folks. By adding the word grave to define a place of the dead, most will imagine a place for the body. Just simple as that. However, if I define the place of the dead by using the word Hades instead of grave, most will not just imagine a place for the body, but for the soul in an afterlife. And that afterlife isn't a pleasant one, folks. There's a huge difference, and the implications are enormous. You know, for those within Christendom who endorse and flippantly use the word Hades as a place for the dead, you know, you've got to consider the way the average person thinks, rather than just how you've been taught. I implore you to reconsider for their sake, for everyone's sake. All right? You know, if a person who flippantly uses the word Hades, you know, I've got two challenges for you who do that within teaching or sharing, what have you. Ask anyone outside your immediate circle of influence. Just anybody that just doesn't hang out with you all the time. All right? Ask them, what does Hades mean to you? Ask them. And I guarantee most will redefine it as hell. That should tell you something. Just that one little tidbit should tell you something. And second, I challenge you to judge the fruit and how they defined Hades by defining it as hell. And how hell slanders God. So if they define Hades as hell and hell slanders God, doesn't Hades slander God? Okay, since Judaism, I'm not talking about individual Jews here and there, but the actual religion of Judaism. They never believed or taught in an afterlife, but they focused mainly on the life here and now and resurrection. This is why Sheol didn't represent the place of the dead as an afterlife experience, but only as a place for the body. And I got that information out of the Jewish Encyclopedia, by the way, online. On more than one occasion, both Jesus and Paul, they really confirmed that notion that it just meant a place for the body, because they referred, both of them in Scripture, referred to death as only sleep. So does sleep sound like an afterlife experience to you folks? Sure doesn't to me. However, one might claim that the rich man died in the parable. Well, first of all, it was a parable. You got to consider that. And second, Jesus purposely used the Hebrew word for unseen in that scripture. Not Hades. I don't care what it says in Luke. I could care less. It uses the word Hades in that. But it was later translated in the Greek as, and I've got a version of it here. I can show you in my notes, my goofy notes. This is the word that was used, okay, in the Greek. You notice it doesn't look anything like Hades either. It doesn't look like hell. It doesn't look like Sheol. It doesn't look like Gehenna. Okay, it doesn't look like any of those. And that word simply translates as not self-evident, properly unclear, indistinct, not immediately obvious. It's evident figuratively, indefinite, uncertain, not evident, not perceived, unrecognized, clandestine, secret, unknown, or not understood. Okay, notice how Jesus didn't use the word Sheol, even though he was speaking to Hebrew-speaking people. And the definition of unseen definitely fits a narrative of the parable. Yet most agenda-driven Bibles use hell or Hades, which doesn't fit the agenda unless you have a different agenda than the one Jesus had. So in conclusion of this video, I know word usage and meanings change over time. It just does. That's how it is. And I also know I'm coming against years of academia and language experts and Bible scholars. I know that. But judge the fruit of the word Hades. Judge the fruit that the word Hades produces in the minds of the ignorant. We're supposed to be encouraging one another. That doesn't encourage anyone. So why support an ancient Greek agenda? Back there in 132 BC, why even go there? It doesn't make sense. Most importantly, why even perpetuate the problem by endorsing a word that can cause people to stumble? Because most people don't think the same as everyone else, okay? You know, of defining something. And believe me, Hades is definitely not defined the same by everyone. It just isn't. So why even cause people to stumble? You know, those who reject hell, like myself, but still embrace Hades, which I don't, it's like a person who refuses to eat horse manure, but serves up a dish of dog shit. It just doesn't make sense. Thank you for viewing.